My mother sat on the rooftop ledge, threatening to end it all as my father begged her to come down, his voice cracking with a lifetime of pain. I looked at him, my heart like ice, and said, "Dad, let her go." I still remember the stage, high above the world, a rooftop shimmering under the cold autumn sun. That's where I found her, my mother, Eleanor. She sat on the ledge, her hair a dramatic curtain against the vast blue sky, and her voice, usually a sharp instrument of manipulation, was a wailing, theatrical sob. She wasn't begging for her life, she was demanding control, using the very threat of her own death as a final, cruel act of ownership over my father, Robert. He stood a few feet back, his body a trembling monument to decades of silent suffering. His face was a roadmap of exhaustion, a canvas of all the times he'd given in, all the times he'd believed her empty promises. In that single, chilling moment, I realized this wasn't an act of desperation, but the opening scene of a play I'd already lived through. I knew the lines, the cues, and the tragic ending. But this time, something was different. This time, I wasn't a spectator. If you've ever felt trapped in a situation you knew wasn't right, leave a like and join me as we uncover this story. This time, a strange, electric clarity buzzed through my veins, a feeling like a cosmic rewind button had been pressed. I was back. Back to the day it all started. Back to the day when her threats were still just threats, when I could still change the script. That flicker of clarity, that feeling of a cosmic rewind, wasn't a gift. It was a download of every nightmare I had lived before, a torrent of memories that hit me like a physical blow. The first image was the plate of shrimp scampi, glistening with butter, placed in front of me. She knew about my severe shellfish allergy, but insisted it would toughen me up. Every bite was an act of faith, a gamble with my own breath. I remembered the A on my final exam in senior year. I was a straight A student, but a single B+ was enough for her to stand me in front of the entire family and slap me across the face, a public spectacle meant to teach me a lesson about perfection. But the worst memory, the one that burned like acid, was the end. After her volatile new partner's son took everything from me, she didn't mourn. She saw a business opportunity. I remembered her cold voice on the phone, forging my signature to drain the trust fund my grandmother had left for me, the one thing that would have protected me. She sold all my personal belongings, piece by piece, as if they were nothing more than junk. My life wasn't just taken from me, it was profited from. It was a secret, whispered truth hidden behind a veneer of normalcy and social grace. If you've ever had a secret like this lurking beneath the surface of your family's story, share a number from 1 to 10 in the comments below, rating how well you've kept it hidden. Let's see how many of us have carried this burden. I knew, watching her sob on that rooftop, that she was just playing out the final scene of that exact, terrible narrative. A new beginning, built on the ashes of my old one. But not this time. Not on my watch. The memory of my last life's demise snapped into focus, and my feet, once frozen in passive dread, moved with a purpose I'd never known. I walked toward my father, my hand reaching for his, and as he stood on the precipice of another decade of misery, I pulled him back, not from the ledge, but from the chasm of his own self-denial. His face was a mask of shock as I looked up at him and spoke the words I never had the courage to say before. "Dad," I said, my voice steady, "let her go." He flinched, as if the words were a physical blow. "But, your mother," he stammered, still pleading with Eleanor's retreating figure. "Doesn't she have the right to her own happiness?" I asked, a hint of steel in my voice. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth, but it was the only argument he would understand. He had spent his entire life accommodating her so-called happiness. He was so deeply shocked, he just nodded, numbly. The rest was a blur of paperwork, a quick trip to the courthouse. My father, who had spent his entire life as an honest, dependable man, seemed to be moving in a daze. He signed the divorce papers, his hand trembling slightly. Eleanor, on the other hand, was beaming. The moment the ink was dry, she practically skipped out to Vince's dilapidated truck, throwing herself into his arms without a second glance. The sight of her waving goodbye, her face flushed with triumph, should have broken my heart. Instead, I felt a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying fall away. My father, standing beside me, let out a slow, shaky breath. We were finally free. We didn't go home. We walked down the street, my hand in my father's, the silence between us a strange and welcome thing. We stopped at a small, family-owned diner, the kind with red vinyl booths and the comforting scent of fried onions and warm coffee. It was the first time I'd ever sat in a restaurant with my father. He ordered meatloaf and gravy, and I chose the chicken pot pie. For all my 16 years on this earth, I had subsisted on whatever burnt toast and excuses my mother deigned to leave for me. But as the waiter placed that hot plate in front of me, with its flaky, golden crust and rich, savory aroma, I felt something I had never felt before. Deep, profound peace. The simple act of eating a hot, nourishing meal, made by someone who cared enough to do it right, brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't just food, it was a revelation. It was the first breath of true freedom, the quiet hum of a life no longer overshadowed by chaos. It was the feeling of being cared for, not just physically, but spiritually. It was the first tangible proof that our future could be different. Think back to a moment when you finally felt free from a heavy burden. What did that feel like? Share your experience in the comments below. My father, sensing my emotion, didn't ask why I was crying. He simply reached across the table and squeezed my hand, a silent promise that this was only the beginning of our new life. That meal was just the beginning. As we sat there, the weight of decades of silent resentment began to lift, replaced by a quiet, honest conversation we had never been allowed to have. My father, with a sigh that seemed to release a lifetime of burdens, confessed that Eleanor's endless criticisms had chipped away at his self-worth. She always said I was a worthless man, a failure for not making more money, he admitted, his eyes downcast. But I knew the truth. I looked at his hands, calloused and strong from years of labor at the factory, and spoke with a conviction that came from my very core. That's not true, Dad, I said firmly. You worked yourself to the bone for us. You are the kindest, most decent man I've ever known. You are not a failure, she was. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise and then relief washing over his face. He had spent so long hearing her lies, he had almost come to believe them. But now, with me as his unwavering support, he was beginning to see the truth. I felt a pang of guilt for not having been there for him sooner, for having been so blind to her manipulation. So I took his hand, and I made a silent vow, not just to protect him, but to help him heal. You deserve happiness, Dad, I told him softly, and if you ever find a woman who makes you happy, you have every right to pursue that. Don't ever think you don't. I could see the profound gratitude in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't just my father. He was a man on his own journey toward a life he truly deserved. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and for the first time in my life, I knew what true peace felt like. With Eleanor gone, our home stopped being a war zone and became a sanctuary. My father, with a gentle nudge from me, reached out to a woman from his past, his high school sweetheart, Carol. She was everything Eleanor wasn't: kind, gentle, and utterly devoted to the people she loved. She'd never married, a quiet testament to a broken heart that had finally found its way home. Carol brought a warmth into our lives that we hadn't realized we were missing. She'd arrive with fresh-baked pies, listen to my father's stories from the factory, and simply sit with us in the evenings. She saw my father's goodness and cherished it, just as she saw my determination and nurtured it. My grades, which had always been a source of pressure, now became a source of genuine pride. I was thriving, finally free to focus on my future without the constant threat of a manipulative parent hovering over me. The house was clean, the meals were hot, and the laughter was real. It was a simple, beautiful life, the one my father and I had always deserved. We were finally a family, a unit built on respect and genuine love. Things were so perfect, in fact, that we started making plans. Dad and Carol had started talking about getting married, about making this beautiful new reality permanent. We were happy. We were finally, truly, safe. And that, of course, is precisely when she came back. The peace was a fragile thing, and it shattered with the force of a screaming voice I knew all too well. It was a normal afternoon, the sun shining on our quiet street, when Eleanor, my mother, returned. But she wasn't alone. She was with Vince, and she was very, very pregnant. She stormed up the walkway, her face a mask of furious self-righteousness. She found Carol on the front porch, watering the flowers, and without a word of warning, she grabbed her by the hair, dragging her into the yard. Carol, so gentle and kind, didn't know how to fight back. Eleanor was screaming, her voice raw with manufactured rage, calling Carol a whore and a homewrecker and a bitch, spewing vile lies as the neighbors began to gather, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. It was a replay of a scene I'd watched before, a twisted theater performance where she was the star and everyone else was a disposable prop. I saw the fear in Carol's eyes, the humiliation of being publicly shamed for a love she had every right to feel. My father, who was just coming home from work, froze in his tracks, his face pale with horror. The old him, the one from my past life, would have tried to reason with her, to beg, to appease. But the new me felt something else entirely. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, protective rage. This woman was threatening the first real family I had ever known, the first true home. When you see someone you love being attacked, what is your first instinct? Do you retreat or do you fight back? Let me know in the comments below. I wasn't going to let her win this time. Not on my street. Not in my life. In my previous life, I stood frozen, paralyzed by the chaos my mother created. This time, I knew I had to act. I pushed through the stunned neighbors, my focus honed and sharp. I didn't waste a single breath arguing with Eleanor. I knew that was a losing game. Instead, I pulled out my phone and held up the papers I had brought with me, our official divorce certificate. I let the crowd see the date, a date months after Eleanor had left and gotten pregnant with Vince's child. "Everybody, look," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "My father and my mother have been officially divorced for over 2 months. My father and Carol have every right to be together. And my mother has no right to attack her like this." The crowd's whispers turned to murmurs of understanding. The narrative she was so desperate to control was crumbling before her very eyes. But I wasn't done. While she stood there, her mouth gaping in shock, I calmly called 911. "I'd like to report an assault," I stated clearly into the phone. "My mother, Eleanor, is physically attacking my father's new partner, Carol. My mother is currently pregnant, and she is out of control." Eleanor's face went white. She had always used chaos as a weapon, but the cold, logical hand of the law was something she'd never had to face. As she realized the full weight of my action, I saw Vince, the man she had run off with, slink away into the shadows like the coward he was. The street was no longer her stage. It was now a legal crime scene, and she was the perpetrator. The police arrived swiftly, and for the first time in her life, Eleanor's manufactured chaos was met with cold, unyielding authority. She tried her usual tricks, the tearful pleas and exaggerated sighs, but the officers were unmoved. They were concerned with facts, the assault, the witnesses, and the very real divorce papers. Because of her pregnancy, she was not taken to a holding cell. Instead, a legal order was put in place. She would be confined to her home for the next 3 months, and her every movement would be monitored. It wasn't a prison, but for a woman who lived for public spectacle and social manipulation, it was a sentence of unimaginable torment. The officer pulled me aside, explaining our options. We could drop the charges in exchange for a small financial settlement, or we could see the legal consequences through. My eyes met Carol's prunins.com. She was bruised and shaken, but her gaze was steady and unwavering. It wasn't about money. It was about justice. "No," I told the officer firmly. "We want her to be held accountable." I knew that for Eleanor, being restricted, being unable to run her mouth and orchestrate her schemes, was the most effective punishment of all. If you've ever had to use the system, be it legal, professional, or personal, to find justice, I want to hear your story. What was the outcome? Share it below. I understood then that freedom wasn't just about escape. It was about ensuring the person who had once trapped you could never do so again. And for 3 months, at least, we would have that peace. The 3 months of Eleanor's house arrest weren't a time of passive waiting. They were a time of strategic preparation. I knew that the moment she was free, she would come back with a new wave of lies and manipulations. So, I took the offensive. I became a storyteller, but my story was a weapon, the unvarnished truth. I went from neighbor to neighbor, to the local grocery store, and even to my high school, carefully, calmly, and factually laying out the whole sordid affair. I told the local gossip circles about the divorce, about Eleanor's affair with a man named Vince, and about her pregnancy. I described, in dispassionate detail, her violent attack on Carol and her subsequent house arrest. My voice was quiet, without a hint of the drama Eleanor would have used. I didn't cry or scream, I just presented the facts. I told my classmates and teachers about my home life, about the years of neglect and emotional abuse. My narrative was so simple, so stark, it stood in direct contrast to the theatrical melodrama that Eleanor would inevitably perform. The whispers of the neighborhood, which had initially been tinged with judgment toward Carol, now turned into a unified chorus of support. By the time Eleanor was released, the public had already formed its opinion. The ground she would have stood on to launch her attacks was already poisoned. She would no longer be the victim or the star. She would be the town pariah. The power of a single truth, spoken without emotion, was far more potent than any lie she could conjure. I had built a shield of public opinion, and it was unbreakable. The 3 months of quiet passed, and just as I predicted, Eleanor's return to public life was met with cold shoulders and averted gazes. My shield of truth had held. For a while, I allowed myself to believe I had truly won, that the worst was over. But I had forgotten one crucial piece of the puzzle, a variable from my past life that I had foolishly underestimated. The real danger wasn't my mother's theatrics, it was the quiet, simmering violence she had allied herself with. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, in my history class. The teacher introduced a new student, a boy who had just moved to town. His name was Dylan. He was Vince's son. He was older than the rest of us, his face a blank canvas, but his eyes held a chilling emptiness that I recognized instantly. The whispers in the classroom started immediately. Everyone knew his story. He had spent 3 years in a juvenile correctional facility for a crime so disturbing it had become a local legend, a campaign of psychological terror and stalking against another girl that had nearly driven her to madness. He was the one who, in my previous life, had been the instrument of my end. He wasn't loud or aggressive, he was something far worse. He was a predator who knew how to wait. That feeling, that cold dread that washes over you when you are in the presence of true malice, is unmistakable. They say your gut feeling is never wrong. Have you ever met someone and just known, deep down, that something was off? Tell me about that experience in the comments. The game had changed. This wasn't a battle of wits and public opinion anymore. This was a battle for my very survival. With Dylan's silent, watchful presence now a constant shadow in my school life, Eleanor made her next move. She appeared one afternoon as I was leaving school, not with rage, but with a smile so sweet it was venomous. Her performance had shifted from tragedy to a saccharine play about reconciliation. She pulled out a sheaf of official-looking documents, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Kate, darling," she began. "I know we've had our differences, but this changes everything." She spun a tale of a long-lost, wealthy relative of Vince's who had passed away, leaving behind a staggering inheritance, millions of dollars. The money was tied up in a complicated trust, she explained, and Vince's family didn't trust her. Her offer was as predictable as it was insulting. She needed my help. She needed me to be the respectable, intelligent granddaughter figure to win over the family's trust. In return, she promised me a future I could only dream of, college paid in full, a car, a trust fund of my own. "This money is for us, Kate," she purred, placing a hand on her swollen belly. "For you, and for your little brother. We can finally be the family we were always meant to be." I listened, feigning wide-eyed wonder, but inside, a cold, hard knot of recognition formed in my stomach. It was the same lie, the same desperate ploy from my past life, just repackaged with a bigger price tag. She wasn't offering me a future, she was offering me a cage, baited with money. And as I looked at her, I decided it was time to stop reacting to her schemes and start orchestrating one of my own. I let a thoughtful silence hang in the air, a perfect imitation of a conflicted teenager weighing a life-changing decision. "Wow, Mom," I said, my voice full of manufactured awe. That's That's incredible. Her eyes lit up, sensing victory. That was my cue. I leaned in, my expression turning to one of gentle, innocent concern. There's just one thing I don't understand, I whispered. What about Dylan? He is Vince's son, after all. I'm sure a big part of that inheritance is meant for him, right? Her smile tightened. Before she could spin another lie, I continued, my voice dropping to a sympathetic murmur. It's just, well, I've heard you talking to some of your new friends about how worried you are about him. How he's a troubled case, and how you need to make sure all that money is protected for the new baby. I looked over her shoulder, my gaze distant. He seems so lonely at school. No one will even sit with him because of the stories everyone tells. It must be so hard, feeling like an outcast. I can't imagine how much worse he'd feel if he found out he was being cut out of his own family's future, too. The trap was set. I was simply repeating her own words, her own malicious gossip, but framing it as a tragedy for her new stepson. Her face went pale, a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes as she realized the corner I had just painted her into. Imagine you're in a situation with no good choices. Do you choose the path of direct confrontation, or do you play the long game, using your opponent's own weaknesses against them? Type confront or strategy in the comments. I had just handed a loaded weapon to the most dangerous person in her life, and all I had to do now was walk away. I didn't wait for her to stammer out a defense. My work was done. I gave her a small, pitying smile. Anyway, I've got to go, I said, my voice light and breezy. Dad and Carol are making that chicken pot pie I love, and I don't want to be late. The mention of my new, happy family was the final, twisting turn of the knife. I turned and walked away, not once looking back. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden drop in temperature as a new presence entered the scene. The air grew heavy, charged with a silence far more terrifying than her earlier screaming. I didn't see him directly, but I knew he was there. I knew that he had been standing in the shadows of the school building the entire time, listening to every word. He had heard her dismiss him, heard her plot to steal his future, heard my feigned sympathy for his plight. As I reached the corner of the street, I risked a quick glance over my shoulder. There he was, Dylan, standing directly in front of Eleanor, blocking her path. He wasn't touching her. He wasn't even speaking. He was just looking at her, his face a blank slate of cold, simmering rage. She, for the first time in her life, looked utterly powerless, a cornered animal facing a predator she had just betrayed. I had lit a fuse and walked away, and now the explosion was hers, and hers alone, to deal with. The monster she had brought into our lives was no longer my problem. It was hers. As I walked home, the scent of autumn leaves in the air, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a thrill of victory. I felt a profound, and almost unsettling, quiet. The constant noise in my head, the hum of anxiety and the dread of her next move, a soundtrack that had played for my entire life, had finally gone silent. I never found out what happened between Eleanor and Dylan in the school parking lot that day. I never asked, and no one ever told me. A week later, I heard through town gossip that she and Vince had left town abruptly. There were rumors of a terrible fight, of money gone missing, of a darkness that had finally consumed itself. But they were just rumors. All I knew for sure was that she was gone. My victory wasn't in some grand, explosive confrontation. It was in the quiet act of walking away, of understanding that you cannot fight fire with fire. Sometimes, you just have to let the fire burn itself out. I had simply pointed the flames of her own making back at their source. She had built her life on a foundation of manipulation and cruelty, and in the end, that was the very thing that consumed her. My father, Carol, and I continued to build our lives on a different foundation, one of quiet respect, gentle kindness, and the simple, unwavering truth. The ghost of my past life had been laid to rest, not by revenge, but by a quiet, calculated act of self-preservation. I was no longer a character in her play. I was the author of my own story. Years have passed since that autumn afternoon. I'm in my final year of university now, studying to be a therapist, a path I chose so I could help others find the voice I so nearly lost. My father and Carol are married, their home a quiet testament to a love that was patient enough to wait a lifetime. Laughter is the most common sound within those walls now. Sometimes, I think back to that girl on the rooftop, the one watching her mother perform a tragedy. And I realize the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge. It was about authority. The authority to say no more. The authority to choose your own family, to protect your own peace, and to write your own ending. We are all handed a script at the beginning of our lives, one written by our parents, our circumstances, our past. For a long time, I thought I was bound to those pages, destined to play out the same heartbreaking story over and over. But freedom isn't about erasing the past, it's about having the courage to write a new chapter, and then another, and another, until the story is finally, truly, your own. It's about building a life so full of warmth and light that the shadows of what came before have no place to hide. My victory wasn't the day my mother left, it was every quiet, happy day that followed. It was the peace in my father's eyes, the warmth of Carol's home, and the unshakable knowledge that I am the sole author of my life. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe in the power to rewrite your own script, then please hit that subscribe button. Join our community, where we share stories not of victimhood, but of profound and unshakable strength.